Beyond Honor teases the gripping and emotional journey of Marcus Taylor, a decorated black ex-Marine who faces a new battlefield, the streets of his own country. After a routine traffic stop turns violent, Marcus finds himself at the mercy of two racist police officers who treat him with contempt, unaware of his decorated past. Armed only with his dignity and evidence of their brutality, Marcus must decide whether to stay silent or fight for justice in a town deeply divided by race and prejudice. As the community rallies behind their police force, Marcus becomes an unlikely symbol of resistance and hope. In his quest for truth, he is joined by a fierce civil rights attorney, Danielle Rivers, as they uncover a web of corruption that runs far deeper than anyone imagined. What begins as a personal fight for respect turns into a larger battle for systemic change, forcing Marcus to confront not only his past but the ongoing fight for equality in a country that often fails to honor its heroes. In Beyond Honor, justice isn't just a concept, it's a hard-fought battle. Will Marcus's inner strength and determination be enough to tear down the walls of prejudice, or will the weight of the system crush him before he can rise? A tall, muscular black man in his early 40s, with closely cropped black hair, a stern face softened by deep, thoughtful eyes. He has a strong, upright posture, a remnant of his military training. Backstory: a decorated ex-Marine, Marcus served in multiple combat zones, earning medals for bravery and leadership. After retiring from the military, he returned home to a quiet life, hoping to leave behind the violence and embrace peace. However, the discrimination he faces as a black man in his own country forces him to confront a new battle, one for justice and respect. Physical description: mid-30s, with a bulky frame and a shaved head. He has cold, blue eyes and a permanent scowl, his face often flushed with arrogance. His uniform fits tightly over his large frame, exuding an intimidating presence. Backstory: a police officer who hides his insecurities behind a tough, aggressive exterior. Rick grew up in a conservative, predominantly white town where he learned to fear and resent those who didn't look like him. His unchecked racism festers in his work, leading to frequent abuse of power, especially against minorities. Physical description: early 30s, tall and lanky with sandy blonde hair and light freckles. His youthful face and wide eyes give him a deceptively innocent look, but his body language reveals nervousness and indecisiveness. Backstory: Kevin is a rookie cop eager to prove himself but easily influenced by stronger personalities, particularly his partner, Rick. Though he harbors doubts about Rick's methods, his fear of confrontation and desire for acceptance keep him complicit in the department's discriminatory practices. Physical description: a sharp, poised black woman in her late 30s, with short natural curls and a commanding presence. She has warm brown eyes but a stern, no-nonsense expression that shows her strength and determination. Backstory: a civil rights attorney with a history of taking on cases of police misconduct. Having grown up in a family of activists, Danielle has dedicated her life to fighting injustice. She becomes Marcus's attorney, recognizing his case as a pivotal moment to challenge systemic racism in law enforcement. Physical description: in his late 50s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a well-groomed mustache. He is slightly overweight but carries himself with authority, his pale blue eyes hinting at the decades of service behind them. Backstory: the captain of the local police force, Harrison believes in upholding the law but has turned a blind eye to the racism within his department. He is torn between loyalty to his officers and the growing pressure to take responsibility for their actions. Description: a modest, single-story house located on the outskirts of town. The home is simple but well-kept, with framed photos of Marcus's military past lining the walls and a small backyard where he finds peace. It serves as his sanctuary, a sharp contrast to the turmoil outside. Description: a typical small-town police department with outdated furniture and buzzing fluorescent lights. The station has a cold, sterile feel, with officers' desks cluttered with paperwork. It is here that the toxic culture of racial profiling thrives, hidden beneath the veneer of law enforcement. Description: a quiet town with a mix of old brick buildings and new developments. Its picturesque main street hides the underlying racial tensions. Riverton feels both cozy and suffocating, depending on who you are, with predominantly white neighborhoods sharply divided from poorer, predominantly black areas. Description: a sleek, modern office in a nearby city, filled with bookshelves of legal texts and framed articles on civil rights cases. Danielle's office is both welcoming and professional, with large windows overlooking the bustling city, symbolizing hope and justice. It contrasts sharply with the small-town mentality of Riverton. Description: a grand but outdated courtroom with wooden benches and towering windows that let in streams of sunlight. The room holds a sense of history, with echoes of past cases lingering in the air. It is here that Marcus's fight for justice will unfold, with a tense atmosphere as the town watches. Cause: Marcus seeks peace after military service. Effect: he takes a drive to clear his mind. Cause: Marcus drives through town, reflecting on his past. Effect: he unknowingly enters an area under police surveillance. Cause: Marcus is pulled over by officers Rick and Kevin. Effect: tension rises as Rick becomes aggressive. Cause: Rick's hostility escalates. Effect: Marcus discreetly records the interaction. Cause: Rick physically assaults Marcus. Effect: Marcus remains calm but humiliated, setting up the legal fight. Cause: Marcus reviews the footage and considers his options. Effect: he contacts Danielle Rivers, a civil rights lawyer. Cause: Marcus seeks legal counsel. Effect: Danielle agrees to take the case, seeing its potential to challenge systemic racism. Cause: Danielle begins preparing Marcus's case. Effect: she uncovers other instances of police misconduct in Riverton. Cause: news of Marcus's incident leaks to the press. Effect: the town becomes divided, with some supporting Marcus and others backing the police. Cause: the police department faces backlash. Effect: Captain John Harrison pressures Rick and Kevin to stay quiet, but Rick grows defensive. Cause: the media attention puts Marcus in the spotlight. Effect: Marcus, initially reluctant, decides to fully commit to the fight for justice. Cause: Rick feels cornered by the media and internal pressure. Effect: he becomes more hostile and starts covering up his actions. Cause: Kevin is haunted by the incident and feels guilty. Effect: he quietly considers confessing, but fears the consequences. Cause: news spreads, leading to protests from civil rights groups. Effect: tensions rise in Riverton, with protests turning violent at times. Cause: Rick confronts Marcus during a protest. Effect: the confrontation escalates, with Rick threatening Marcus, solidifying him as an antagonist. Cause: Danielle's team uncovers evidence of a broader pattern of racial profiling in Riverton. Effect: this new evidence strengthens their case, setting the stage for a courtroom showdown. Cause: Danielle prepares Marcus for the upcoming trial. Effect: Marcus feels the weight of the trial but remains determined. Cause: the trial opens with both sides presenting their cases. Effect: tensions rise as the evidence against the police department mounts. Cause: Kevin struggles with his guilt and takes the stand. Effect: he gives a conflicted testimony, revealing cracks in the police's defense. Cause: Rick testifies, denying all accusations and painting Marcus as aggressive. Effect: his testimony enrages Marcus, but Danielle advises him to remain calm. Cause: Danielle presents the video footage of the incident. Effect: the courtroom is stunned by the clear evidence of misconduct, shifting public opinion toward Marcus. Cause: both sides give their final arguments. Effect: the jury is left with a tough decision, while Marcus waits anxiously for the verdict. Cause: the town remains divided, with protests and counter-protests erupting outside the courthouse. Effect: the tension reaches a boiling point as everyone waits for the verdict. Cause: the jury reaches a decision. Effect: Marcus wins the case, and the police department is found guilty of misconduct. The decision sparks a mixture of celebration and outrage within the community. Cause: Rick is disgraced and fired from the force. Effect: he tries to leave town, but his reputation is in tatters. Kevin, on the other hand, considers coming forward with more information to clear his conscience. Cause: Marcus reflects on the journey from victim to victor. Effect: he realizes that while the battle was won, the fight for justice is ongoing. He considers becoming an advocate for police reform, deciding that his role as a Marine was only part of his legacy. Now, he will continue to fight for others. Cause: the town grapples with the trial's aftermath. Effect: Riverton is forced to confront its deep-rooted issues with racism, as protests continue and new reforms are proposed. Cause: Marcus receives an offer to become involved in broader civil rights activism. Effect: after much thought, Marcus decides to use his platform to continue fighting for justice across the country. Cause: Danielle celebrates the victory but remains focused on other cases of police misconduct. Effect: she gains new attention and resources to continue her work, while also deepening her bond with Marcus as they prepare for future battles. Cause: the police department undergoes restructuring in the wake of the trial. Effect: Captain Harrison resigns, and new leadership promises change, though doubts remain within the community about the sincerity of these efforts. Cause: Marcus prepares to leave Riverton behind, realizing his fight is not limited to one town. Effect: he leaves Riverton with hope and determination, ready to face the next challenge in his ongoing battle for justice and equality. Marcus Taylor sat in his small, modest backyard, staring out at the fading light as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine trees from the nearby woods, a smell that always calmed him. It was in moments like this, surrounded by silence, that he could almost forget the noise of battle, the screams, the gunfire. Almost. His hands rested on his knees, calloused fingers tracing the rough denim of his jeans. On the patio table beside him was a half-empty cup of coffee, long gone cold. Next to it, a folded newspaper with a headline that had been gnawing at his mind all day: "Tensions rise over allegations of police misconduct." The article had brought back memories, ones he had tried to bury when he returned from his last deployment. But no matter how much Marcus tried to focus on his civilian life, the weight of what he had seen, and the injustice he now witnessed in his own country, was inescapable. He had fought for freedom and justice abroad, but it seemed he was still battling those very ideals at home. He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Maybe a drive would clear his head, he thought. Standing, he grabbed his car keys from the hook by the door and slid into the driver's seat of his old but reliable sedan. The soft hum of the engine was comforting as he pulled out of his driveway and onto the empty road. The streets of Riverton were quiet, as they usually were at this time of night. Small towns had a way of closing down early, the day's hustle giving way to the calm of night. As Marcus drove, his mind wandered. The town had been home for as long as he could remember, but after his years of service, something about it felt different. He no longer fit in the way he once did. He passed by the diner where he used to go with friends, now closed for the night. A sense of nostalgia washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by something darker when he saw the familiar blue and red lights of a police cruiser ahead, patrolling the area. Marcus stiffened, but he reminded himself he had done nothing wrong. He wasn't speeding, wasn't causing any trouble. He was just a man trying to find some peace. Still, the sight of the cruiser triggered a tight knot of anxiety in his chest. The cruiser pulled to the side of the road, letting Marcus pass. He exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the tension, but the feeling of being watched remained. The world had changed, and he could feel it in the way people looked at him, in the way their gazes lingered too long. As he rounded the corner onto a quieter street, his rearview mirror lit up with flashing lights. "Great," Marcus muttered under his breath as he pulled over, the cruiser's headlights flooding the interior of his car. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the knot in his stomach tightened. The cruiser door opened, and two officers stepped out. Marcus watched them approach in the side mirror, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lankier and younger. His gut told him this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "License and registration," the taller officer, Rick Davis, barked before even reaching the window. His face was cold, his blue eyes hard as they flicked over Marcus. The other officer, Kevin Walsh, stood behind Rick, looking uneasy, as though he didn't quite know where to place his hands. Marcus kept his movements slow and deliberate as he retrieved his wallet and handed over his license. "What's the issue, officer? You were driving a bit too slow, wouldn't you say?" Rick replied, inspecting the license without looking up. Where you headed this time of night? Just out for a drive. Clearing my head. Rick's lips curled into a smirk. Out for a drive? Late at night? Seems suspicious. Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral. Didn't know it was a crime to drive late. Rick's eyes darkened. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but he'd been through enough to know how these situations could escalate if he didn't comply. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. Rick motioned for Marcus to stand by the hood of his car, while Kevin kept his distance, his hands still twitching at his belt. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes on him. A judgment passed before they even knew his name. Rick moved to the driver's side of the vehicle and began searching through the glove compartment without asking. Marcus clenched his jaw. His years in the Marines had taught him how to control his anger, but that control was wearing thin. Why are you searching my car? I didn't give consent, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Rick glanced up, smirking. Looks like a car that might have something to hide. You know how it is, gotta be thorough. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He had nothing to hide, but the casual abuse of power was all too familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out, and it wouldn't be the last. His hand moved to his phone in his pocket, fingers quickly finding the record button. He needed to document this. As Rick continued his unnecessary search, Kevin shifted nervously by the car. His eyes met Marcus's for a moment, and there was a flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, but it quickly faded as he looked away. Everything in order? Marcus asked, a bitter edge to his voice. Rick slammed the glove compartment shut and stood up. Not yet. Turn around. Marcus felt the blood rush to his ears. You're kidding me. I said, turn around, Rick repeated, stepping closer. The threat was clear in his voice, and Marcus knew this was going to end badly if he didn't comply. Grinding his teeth, Marcus turned, placing his hands on the hood of the car. He felt Rick's hands roughly patting him down, the touch invasive and unnecessary. Kevin stood to the side, watching but not interfering. Suddenly, Rick shoved him, hard enough that Marcus stumbled against the car. He caught himself before he could fall, anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Careful, Marine, Rick sneered. Don't want to give me a reason to arrest you. Rick stepped back, satisfied with his little display of power. Marcus straightened slowly, fighting to keep his composure. He wanted to turn around and knock that smug look off Rick's face, but he knew that was what the officer wanted, to provoke him, to justify the unjustifiable. You're free to go, Rick said, tossing Marcus's license at him as though it were garbage. Next time, don't be so suspicious. Marcus's hands trembled as he picked up the license and climbed back into his car. He didn't say a word as he closed the door, the weight of the injustice pressing down on his chest. He sat there for a moment, breathing deeply, before finally starting the engine and pulling away. As he drove, his mind raced. This wasn't just another case of racial profiling. This was a blatant abuse of power, and Rick had crossed a line. Marcus had fought for his country, for justice, and now it was time to fight again. This time, on home soil. Once home, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone in his hand. The video recording of the stop sat there, waiting to be used. He could let it go, try to forget it, but the rage he had kept bottled up for years wouldn't let him. It was time to take a stand, to fight back. His fingers dialed a number, and after a few rings, a calm, steady voice answered. Danielle Rivers. Danielle, it's Marcus. We need to talk. Marcus sat across from Danielle Rivers, his fingers tapping nervously on the arm of the chair. Her office was sleek and professional, the large windows overlooking the bustling city outside. Stacks of legal books lined the shelves, and framed news articles detailing her victories in civil rights cases hung on the walls, a testament to her career. Danielle studied Marcus's face, her eyes sharp and thoughtful. I've reviewed the video you sent me, Marcus. This isn't just a case of racial profiling. What Officer Davis did crossed a line. It's assault. Marcus nodded, though the weight of it still hung heavy in his chest. I didn't want it to come to this. I didn't want to start another fight. Danielle leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. But you didn't start this. They did. And the only way we can make sure it doesn't happen again is by holding them accountable. Marcus exhaled slowly. He knew she was right, but the thought of dragging himself through a long, public legal battle filled him with dread. He'd fought in war zones before, but this felt different, more personal. "I'm in," he said finally, his voice steady. "What's our next step?" Danielle smiled, a determined glint in her eye. "First, we file the lawsuit. Then, we dig deeper. This town has a history of looking the other way when it comes to police misconduct. We're going to change that." Over the next few days, Danielle and her legal team dove into the case with a laser focus. Files and records were pulled, and a pattern began to emerge. Riverton wasn't just a small town with a couple of bad cops. It had a systemic problem. Reports of police misconduct, especially toward black residents, had been filed for years, but they'd always been quietly swept under the rug. Danielle's office became a hub of activity as her team worked tirelessly to gather evidence. Marcus spent hours going over his testimony with her, recounting every detail of the night he was stopped. "There's something you need to be prepared for," Danielle said one afternoon as they sat reviewing the case. "They're going to try to discredit you, paint you as the aggressor." Marcus frowned. "How? I didn't do anything." "They'll twist your military background," she explained. "Say you were unstable, that you posed a threat. They'll do whatever it takes to justify what Davis did." Marcus clenched his jaw, the frustration building inside him. "I fought for this country, and now they're going to use that against me?" Danielle's gaze softened. "I know, it's unfair, but we'll be ready. You've got the truth on your side, and that's powerful." News of the lawsuit hit the press quickly, and it wasn't long before Riverton found itself in the spotlight. The story of a black Marine being assaulted by a police officer in his own hometown stirred emotions on both sides. Some residents rallied behind Marcus, organizing small protests outside the police station and demanding justice. Others, however, saw the lawsuit as an attack on their town's law enforcement. They painted Marcus as an outsider, someone trying to tarnish the reputation of good officers. Reporters started showing up at Marcus's home, asking for statements. He avoided the cameras as much as possible, but the attention was impossible to escape. One evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, his phone buzzed with a text from an old friend. It was a simple message: "Stay strong. We've got your back." It was small moments like that, the support from those who knew him, that kept him going. But with each passing day, the pressure mounted. Inside the Riverton police station, tension was rising. Captain John Harrison paced his office, his silver hair neatly combed back, but his face was tight with stress. He'd seen the headlines, heard the whispers around town. His department was under fire, and it was all because of Rick Davis's recklessness. He glared across his desk at Rick, who sat with his arms crossed, his face as defiant as ever. Kevin Walsh stood by the door, looking uncomfortable, as if he wanted to be anywhere but in that room. "You've put us in a hell of a position," Harrison said, his voice low but sharp. "This lawsuit could ruin us. And you know damn well it's not the first time someone's complained about you." Rick shrugged, his expression cold. "I was doing my job. That guy was suspicious, and I handled it." "Handled it?" Harrison's face reddened. "You assaulted him. We're lucky this hasn't blown up more than it already has." Kevin shifted awkwardly, his eyes darting between Harrison and Rick. He wanted to say something, but fear kept him silent. Rick was the dominant force in their partnership, and Kevin had always followed his lead. But now, doubt gnawed at him. He'd seen the footage, the way Rick had treated Marcus. It wasn't right, and deep down, he knew it. "We're going to have to fight this," Harrison continued, rubbing his temples, "and if it comes down to it, you better be ready to defend every decision you made that night." As the days turned into weeks, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. The lawsuit was moving forward, the town was divided, and the media attention was relentless. He'd started this fight, but now it was consuming every part of his life. He sat in his living room late one night, staring at the framed military medals on the wall. They were symbols of his service, of the honor he'd fought to uphold. But now, that same honor felt like a distant memory. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he glanced at the screen. It was Danielle. Marcus. Her voice came through the line, steady as always. I just wanted to check in. I know this isn't easy, but we're making progress. We're going to win this. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face. I didn't expect it to be this hard. The media, the way people look at me now, it's like they don't care what really happened. They just want someone to blame. I get it, Danielle said gently. But remember why you're doing this. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every person who's been through what you have. This is bigger than one case. It's about changing the system. Marcus sat in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice, about making sure that no one else had to endure what he had. I'm all in, he said quietly. Whatever it takes, I'm seeing this through. The following week, a rally was held outside the courthouse, organized by a local civil rights group. Marcus hadn't planned to attend, but as he drove past the gathering crowd, something made him stop. He parked his car and stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people held signs and chanted for justice. A speaker took the makeshift stage, her voice ringing out over the crowd. We're here today because of one man, Marcus Taylor, a man who fought for our country, only to come home and be treated like a criminal. We stand with him, and we demand accountability for those who have abused their power. Marcus felt a swell of emotion as the crowd cheered. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. These people were standing with him, fighting for the same cause. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing his way through the crowd until he reached the front. The speaker saw him, and her eyes lit up with recognition. Marcus, she said, handing him the microphone. Would you like to say a few words? Marcus hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't one for speeches, but as he looked out over the sea of faces, he knew this was a moment he couldn't let pass. He took the microphone and spoke, his voice strong and clear. I never wanted this fight, but now that I'm in it, I'm not backing down. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been wronged, who's been silenced. Together, we're going to make sure our voices are heard. The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a fighter. Rick Davis sat at his kitchen table, the newspaper spread out before him, the front page featuring Marcus's lawsuit. The headline glared at him, Veteran Sues Riverton Police for Brutality. His hands clenched into fists as he scanned the article, anger bubbling inside him. Every word painted him as a villain, a brute, while Marcus was lauded as a hero. It made Rick's blood boil. How dare they? Rick muttered under his breath, crumpling the paper. His wife, Lisa, stood by the counter, watching him carefully. She knew the case was getting to him, but she had her own doubts about how he had handled the situation. Still, she remained silent. Rick stormed out of the kitchen and into the garage, where he paced back and forth. His mind raced with thoughts of how this lawsuit could ruin him. He was already getting looks from some of the guys at the station, like they didn't trust him. And Captain Harrison? He'd practically thrown Rick under the bus, telling him to lay low. But Rick wasn't about to let Marcus Taylor take him down. He wasn't going to let anyone make him look weak. He had done his job. That was all. As he stared at the wall, his fists still clenched, a dark thought crept into his mind. Maybe it was time to fight back. Maybe it was time to show everyone exactly what he was capable of. Meanwhile, across town, Kevin Walsh sat alone in his patrol car, staring blankly at the dashboard. The events of that night with Marcus played over and over in his mind, like a bad dream he couldn't escape. He hadn't spoken to Rick in days, and the more distance he put between them, the clearer things became. Rick had crossed the line. Deep down, Kevin had known it from the moment it happened, but he had stayed quiet, too afraid to speak up. Now, with the lawsuit unfolding and the town divided, the weight of his silence was unbearable. Kevin's hands shook as he reached for his phone. He thought about calling Captain Harrison, telling him the truth about what really happened. But fear held him back. What if Rick found out? What if speaking up made him a target too? He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. The guilt gnawed at him, but the fear was stronger. For now, Kevin would remain silent, though the tension inside him grew with each passing day. The town of Riverton had become a battleground, with protests erupting outside the police station and courthouse. Civil rights groups from neighboring cities had joined in, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus Taylor" and "End Police Brutality." Marcus stood at the edge of one protest, watching as people chanted and marched through the streets. He hadn't expected his case to spark such a movement, but now it was clear that this fight was bigger than just him. It was about the community, about everyone who had been silenced for too long. Danielle stood beside him, her expression determined as she surveyed the growing crowd. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "Public pressure. It'll force the department to make changes." Marcus nodded, though a part of him felt uneasy. He hadn't asked for any of this. He had just wanted justice for himself. But now, it seemed like the entire town was in upheaval because of his case. As the protest continued, a group of counter-protesters gathered on the opposite side of the street. They held signs that read, "Support our police," and "Stop attacking law enforcement." The tension between the two groups was palpable, and Marcus could feel it building. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the crowd, and Marcus saw a man pushing his way toward him. His heart raced as the man got closer, but before anything could happen, Danielle stepped in front of him, her hand on his arm. "Let's go," she said quietly. "We don't need any trouble." Marcus hesitated but nodded, following her away from the crowd. As they walked back to her car, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. Later that evening, as Marcus walked to his car outside the grocery store, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against the side of the building. Rick Davis. His heart skipped a beat as Rick's cold blue eyes locked onto him. Rick straightened, a sneer curling his lips. "Look who it is. The man of the hour." Marcus stopped in his tracks, his body tensing. He hadn't expected to run into Rick like this, but now that they were face to face, the memories of that night came rushing back. "What do you want, Rick?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Rick pushed off the wall, taking a step closer. "You're making a big mistake, Taylor. You think you can drag me through the mud and come out clean? You have no idea what you've started." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not dragging anyone through the mud. I'm just telling the truth." Rick's expression darkened, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might lash out. But instead, Rick leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "You should drop this case while you still can. Things have a way of getting ugly when you dig too deep." Marcus stared at him, unblinking. He wasn't afraid of Rick. Not anymore. "I'm not dropping anything. And you should be careful who you threaten, Rick. You don't scare me." For a moment, the two men stood in tense silence, the air crackling with unspoken danger. Finally, Rick scoffed and turned away, walking back to his truck. But as he drove off, Marcus knew this wasn't the end of it. Rick wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. The next morning, Danielle called Marcus with news that sent a jolt of hope through him. She had uncovered new evidence that could tip the scales in their favor. "Marcus, I just spoke to a former officer who worked in Riverton a few years ago," Danielle explained. "He told me there were other cases, similar to yours, where people filed complaints against Rick and other officers. But those cases were never investigated." Marcus sat up straighter, his mind racing. "So, there's a pattern?" Danielle's voice was firm. "Yes. And if we can get this officer to testify, it'll show that this isn't an isolated incident. Rick's behavior has been a problem for a long time, and the department has been covering it up." Marcus exhaled slowly, a sense of vindication washing over him. For weeks, he had felt like he was fighting a losing battle, like no one believed him. But now, with this new evidence, they had a real chance of exposing the truth. "When can we meet with him?" Marcus asked. "Later this week," Danielle replied. "I'll set it up. But Marcus, we need to be careful. Once this gets out, things could get even more heated." "I understand," Marcus said quietly, "but this is the break we needed." Danielle agreed, and they made plans to meet with the former officer. As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a while, he felt like they had the upper hand. As the weeks passed, the protests continued to grow, and the media coverage intensified. The town was a powder keg, ready to explode, and Marcus knew that everything hinged on what happened next. Danielle had arranged a meeting with the former officer, a man named John Carter, who had left the Riverton police force after a series of disputes with Rick Davis and others. They met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Carter was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, but his voice was steady as he recounted his experiences. "Rick's always been a hothead," he said, "but it's more than that. He targeted people, especially black residents. And the department covered for him every time." Danielle took notes as Carter spoke, her face calm but focused. "Why didn't you come forward before?" she asked. Carter shrugged, a trace of regret in his eyes. "Fear, I guess. Rick had a lot of power in the department, and speaking out would have cost me my career. But now, with everything that's happening, I can't stay silent anymore." Marcus listened in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of Carter's words. It was exactly what they needed to prove that Rick's actions weren't just a one-time thing. They were part of a larger, systemic problem. As they left the diner, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. The sound of shuffling papers and soft murmurs filled Danielle's office as she and Marcus sat at the conference table, finalizing their strategy. Tomorrow, they would face the courtroom. An arena of a different kind for Marcus, but a familiar one for Danielle. She had faced many battles here, but she knew this one held more weight. The stakes weren't just for Marcus. They were for a community that had been silenced for too long. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I want you to be prepared. Tomorrow will be intense. The defense is going to attack your character. They'll bring up your military service and try to paint you as someone who can't control his temper." Marcus nodded, though the weight of it pressed down on him. "I get it. They're going to make me out to be the aggressor." "Yes," Danielle said, looking him directly in the eye. "But we have the truth on our side. Stay calm, no matter what they say. The moment you lose your cool, they'll use it against you." Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I've been in worse situations. I'll handle it." Danielle smiled, admiring his quiet strength. "I know you will, and we'll make sure the jury sees the truth." The courtroom was packed the next morning, a sea of faces from both sides of the conflict. Some came to support Marcus, while others were there in defense of the police force, eager to see him fall. The tension in the room was palpable as the trial began. Marcus sat beside Danielle at the plaintiff's table, his gaze focused forward as the judge entered the room. He had faced fear before, but the nerves coursing through him now were different. This wasn't a battlefield of guns and soldiers. It was one of words and justice. The prosecution presented their opening statements, laying out the facts of the case. How Marcus had been wrongfully pulled over, assaulted, and humiliated by Officer Rick Davis. They emphasized his military service, his character, and the footage that had captured the night in question. Then it was the defense's turn. The defense attorney, a sharp man with a graying beard, approached the jury with an air of confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is about an officer doing his job. Officer Davis acted out of concern for public safety, and it is Mr. Taylor's own behavior that escalated the situation." Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, just as Danielle had instructed. He wouldn't let them get to him. Later in the day, Kevin Walsh was called to the stand. His hands trembled as he swore to tell the truth, and for a moment, he avoided making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. The weight of his guilt had been crushing him for weeks, and now, sitting here under the gaze of the court, it felt unbearable. The defense attorney approached. "Officer Walsh, can you describe the events of that night from your perspective?" Kevin cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "We pulled over Mr. Taylor because he was driving suspiciously slow in a neighborhood that had been flagged for break-ins. Officer Davis conducted the stop, and things escalated." The attorney nodded, pushing gently. "And what was Mr. Taylor's behavior like during the stop?" Kevin hesitated, his mind spinning. He could feel Rick's eyes on him from across the courtroom. He was compliant at first, but things got tense. Danielle stood, her voice strong. "Permission to cross-examine, Your Honor." The judge nodded, and Danielle approached Kevin. "Officer Walsh, you say Mr. Taylor was compliant. So what caused the situation to escalate?" Kevin swallowed hard. "Officer Davis, He got aggressive. He searched the car without consent and he shoved Mr. Taylor. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Marcus felt a surge of relief. Kevin was telling the truth, finally. "And what did you do, Officer Walsh?" Danielle pressed. Kevin's shoulders slumped. "I didn't stop it. I didn't do anything." Danielle nodded, her expression calm but pointed. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Walsh." The following day, Rick Davis took the stand. He was calm, collected, his face set in a mask of defiance. His lawyer had prepped him well, but Marcus could see the arrogance beneath his exterior. Rick believed he would walk away from this unscathed. "Officer Davis," the defense attorney began, "can you explain your actions that night?" Rick straightened in his chair, his voice even. "I was doing my job. Taylor's behavior was suspicious, and I acted accordingly. When he started getting agitated, I had to take control of the situation." The defense attorney nodded, satisfied. "So, in your view, Mr. Taylor was the aggressor?" "Yes," Rick replied, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "I was trying to maintain order. He was the one who couldn't stay calm." Danielle stood and approached the stand, her eyes locked on Rick. "Officer Davis, you say Mr. Taylor was the aggressor, yet we have video footage that shows you shoving him first. Can you explain that?" Rick's jaw tightened. He was resisting. "I had to use force to control the situation." Danielle pressed on, her voice unwavering. "And what about the search of Mr. Taylor's car? Did he consent to that?" Rick's face reddened. "I didn't need his consent. I had probable cause." "Probable cause for what?" Danielle asked, her tone sharp. "Driving too slow in a neighborhood?" The courtroom fell silent as Rick fumbled for a response, his confidence starting to crack. Danielle stepped back, letting the silence speak for itself. It was time for Danielle to present the video footage. The room went still as the screen lit up, showing the grainy but clear recording of the night in question. The jury leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the screen as Rick's actions played out in real time. His rough treatment of Marcus, the unnecessary search, the shove. Everything was captured, indisputable. When the video ended, Danielle turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the truth with your own eyes. Officer Davis abused his power. This isn't about maintaining order, it's about justice." The defense tried to object, claiming that the footage was incomplete, that it didn't show the full story. But the damage had been done. The jury had seen enough. As the trial wound down for the day, Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. The truth was out there now, and the momentum had shifted in their favor. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with anticipation as the jury was sent to deliberate. Marcus sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded in front of him. Danielle was beside him, her calm presence reassuring. "I think we've done everything we can," she whispered. Marcus nodded, but the waiting gnawed at him. He had prepared for battles before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so out of his control. The hours passed slowly, the tension in the room thick. Outside, protesters gathered again, their signs calling for justice, their voices loud enough to be heard inside. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the outcome that would change everything. Finally, the jury returned. The judge called the courtroom to order, and the foreman stood, the verdict in hand. Marcus held his breath as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Rick Davis, guilty of misconduct and assault." A wave of relief crashed over Marcus as the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps. Danielle squeezed his arm, her smile triumphant. They had won. But as Marcus looked around the room, he knew that while this battle was over, the fight for justice was far from finished.